Nigel Farage announced 2 major defections for Reform UK as he took centre stage at a County Durham conference. The Clacton MP surprised the crowd of Reform UK members as he announced he was about to welcome 2 new councillors live on stage. Mr Farage revealed Cathy Hunt, who was an independent councillor representing Woodhouse Close on Durham County Council, had joined Reform UK ahead of local elections in May. Miss Hunt, a single mum from the market town of Crook, told conference attendees, "We're not putting up with Labour and we're not putting up with the Conservatives anymore." She was sitting as an independent councillor on the council after quitting the Conservatives last month in an apparent protest at not being selected by the party to stand for Bishop Auckland. Ms Hunt told the conference she would take the seat for Reform UK at the election in May. The second councillor to defect from the Tories to Reform was Joe Quinn, who represents Ferryhill Ward on Durham County Council. He told the crowd of Reform supporters, "Today's the day I officially defect from the Conservative Party. Changing sides is a sign of strength. I believe in Reform, I believe in our leadership and I believe Nigel Farage." Mr Quinn added, "To the other parties and the political elite, know this, Reform aren't here to take part, Reform are here to take over." The defections mean Reform now has a total of 3 councillors on Labour-dominated Durham County Council, which is a total of 163 councillors, according to the local authority. They also come as Reform UK looks to capitalise on its general election results in the northeast of England at the local elections in England on May 1. Mr Farage sounded an upbeat note as he hailed Reform coming second in the poll last July in 18 out of 27 constituencies in the northeast. He told the conference crowd that a vote for the Conservatives in the region would only result in Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer hanging on to the key of number 10. Announcing the defections, Mr Farage said, "Our numbers today on Durham County Council are going to grow. I have a man and a woman who were both elected 4 years ago as Conservatives, but they've now decided the right thing to do is to come across to us. Great, isn't it?" News of the defections came towards the end of a speech by Mr Farage in which he railed against immigration, education, net zero and the previous Conservative government's handling of Brexit. Here is a summary of internet users' reactions. And finally, and let's just mention it, there is cronyism. Cronyism is, of course, normally associated with corruption. And I'm not suggesting that Reform is corrupt, but I am suggesting that it might be afflicted with cronyism. And how do I know? I'll go back to another point I've already mentioned, the fact that Nigel Farage will not tolerate any form of opposition to his views within the party that he has created. He risked it with UKIP, and he risked it with the Brexit Party, but he will not risk it with Reform. He is in control. And if that isn't a definition of cronyism, in the sense that those who wish to get on have to crony up to Nigel, or they have no chance of doing so, then I don't know what is. And this, again, is a clear indication of a far-right movement, so that's how I view the far-right. Those groupings are what I think are significant, and why I think Reform is a far-right party. I know that there will be those who disagree, and they're very welcome to do so. But this is the criteria I'm using, and that is why I think Reform is on the far-right. And because I find so many of those issues that it promotes repugnant, that is why I will be spending time in 2025 challenging everything that they, and those who are closely aligned to them in the Tory party, stand for. There isn't anybody who pretends that Reform is not at least on the right wing of the Conservative Party or further right than it, and remember that the Tories have shifted significantly towards their right wing over the last decade and moved away from their old one nation view of the world. So, just on that basis alone, purely technically, Reform is clearly on the far right of politics, because if the Tories are in the centre-right, and Labour is on the moderate right, then Reform must be on the far right, and technically that's a term we can use simply to describe where they are, but that isn't sufficient in itself to explain whether they're on the far right. There have to be these other things as well. One of those is a decided bias towards wealth and against working people, and I think we can see that in the behaviour of Reform. It's all in favour of cutting taxes on the wealthy. It doesn't like inheritance tax. It doesn't like capital gains tax. It's biased against corporation tax. But as importantly, it is providing no indication of real support for working people and their rights, and many of its policies would remove the social safety net on which so many people in the UK are dependent. This is a clear bias towards the wealthy, at cost to those who work for a living and who are dependent upon the state to provide services that they could not afford for themselves, and that is an indication of a far-right party. Sound like the Labour Party? People are furious with the current government. Of course, one theory of big socialist states is that if enough people work in the government or on handouts, their incentive is to keep growing the state. At moment it's Norway. Labour heartlands voted to leave the EU. Labour betrayed them, and in the 2019 general election those heartlands annihilated Labour for its betrayal. Labour voters lent the Tories their vote to get Brexit done, but the Tories failed to keep their promises, especially to stop the boats. The Tories were punished and kicked out of government, and Labour came to power, not because it was popular with the electorate. Starmer's Labour got less votes than Calamity Corbyn's, but because Labour were the default party left to govern after the Tories were booted out. Labour's heartland are watching Starmer's Labour crawling to the EU, and those heartlands will be voting for reform. In the Telegraph today, Reform are leading the Tories in all major polls. Reform seeks to shrink the role of government, and that is another indication of a far-right party. It wants actual cuts in government spending and says that they must come. In particular, it questions the role and even the existence of the NHS, which is anathema to most people in the UK, but which Nigel Farage has promoted for a long time, suggesting that there are insurance-based alternatives, which would however be largely unaffordable for most people. Look at the USA for evidence of that. Reform also highlights the significance of military power. There's nothing that Nigel Farage likes more than the chance to be a little bit jingoistic. On the beaches in Normandy, whenever There's an anniversary, he wants to be there celebrating the forces. But he also wants an increase in spending on the forces at a time when he wants to cut government spending in general. This dependence on the forces is a very clear indication of a far-right party. Reform also highlights the significance of military power. There's nothing that Nigel Farage likes more than the chance to be a little bit jingoistic. On the beaches in Normandy, whenever There's an anniversary, he wants to be there celebrating the forces. But he also wants an increase in spending on the forces at a time when he wants to cut government spending in general. This dependence on the forces is a very clear indication of a far-right party. What is the far-right in British politics, and how do I think that Reform relates to that definition? It's a question that I'm being asked, and given the significance of Reform in the UK's current political environment and the rise of the far-right, in my opinion, around the world, it seems an appropriate time to answer the question. 2025 is, in political terms, going to be dominated by these parties. And they are going to try to create narratives that upset the status quo within the politics of the UK as a consequence, and therefore, it seems right to define the terms that I use when I describe a political party as being on the far right. There are quite a number of ways in which I think that this is flagged, and I'm going to highlight a whole series of them. They aren't in numerical order. They aren't necessarily in order of priority. The point is that you have to assemble this evidence across a whole range of indicators to suggest fairly conclusively that a party is on the far right. And that's what I intend to do in this video. The first indication that there is that a party might be on the far right is that it is considered by just about everybody in a society to be further right than all the existing current political parties. And this is undoubtedly true of Reform in the UK.